Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something important. This is a story about a woman who lost everything: her dignity, her freedom, her belief that she was worth anything at all. The world had beaten her down so many times that she forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. But this is also a story about how one act of kindness can change everything. How one person who refuses to look away can pull someone back from the edge of darkness. If you have ever felt worthless, if you have ever believed that you had nothing left to offer except the shell of who you used to be, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the end. I promise you it will be worth it. Now let me take you back to the winter of 1878, to the high plains of Wyoming, to a woman named Mara who was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The wind on the Wyoming plains did not just blow, it hunted. It scraped the earth raw and pushed grit deep into the skin of anything unlucky enough to be caught beneath it. It howled across the flatlands like a living creature, searching for prey, searching for something to destroy. Mara walked through that wind with her head bowed low and her body angled forward as if she were fighting a living enemy. Every step was agony, every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. She had lost track of how many days she had been walking. Maybe 3, maybe 4. Time blurred when your feet were bleeding and the cold felt like 1,000 tiny knives cutting into your skin. Her boots were ruined. The thin soles had split open and she could feel every sharp stone and frozen rut through them. Her left heel was rubbed raw. The blister had burst 2 days ago and now her socks were stiff with dried blood. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle of clothes wrapped in a rough shawl that smelled of lye soap and stale tobacco. It was all she owned now, all she carried from the life she was running from. To the west, mountains rose like jagged teeth against the gray sky. Snow already clung to their peaks, promising a winter that would kill anyone caught without shelter. The sky above was bruised purple, heavy and low, pressing down on the world like a fist. There was no sun, only a dull gray light that offered nothing but the truth. She would not survive another night out here. Mara stumbled and her knee hit the frozen ground hard. A sharp cry rose in her throat, but she swallowed it back down. Crying wasted warmth. Crying wasted water. She had learned that lesson long ago. She pushed herself up with shaking hands, barely keeping her bundle from slipping into the mud. You cannot stop, she told herself. If you stop, the cold takes you. If you stop, Wade wins. If you stop, everything you suffered was for nothing. Silver Creek was far behind her now, but the memory still burned like a fresh wound. She had arrived there 6 months ago, desperate and alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a belly empty from 3 days without food. A woman at the general store had pointed her toward a boarding house that rented rooms to women who had no husbands and no prospects. The boarding house was connected to a gambling hall owned by a man named Wade Carter. Mara had understood immediately what kind of work the women there did. She had no illusions about it. When you are starving and homeless and the winter is coming, you make choices that would horrify the comfortable people who have never known real hunger. She worked upstairs. That was how they said it, working upstairs. The men who came to the gambling hall would pay for her company, and Wade Carter would take most of the money, and Mara would tell herself that she was surviving. That was all she was doing, surviving. But surviving came with a con. Wade Carter was not just a businessman, he was a collector. He kept careful records of everything his girls owed him: room and board, clothing, medicine when they got sick. He added up the numbers with a smile that never reached his cold gray eyes, and he told them that they could leave whenever they wanted, as soon as they paid off their debt. But the debt never got smaller. It only grew. Every month there was some new expense, some new fee, some new reason why the numbers kept climbing. Mara had realized the truth after 3 months. She was not an employee. She was property. Wade Carter owned her just as surely as if he had bought her at auction. And when she tried to leave, when she packed her tiny bundle of belongings and slipped out the back door in the middle of the night, Wade had sent men after her. "Run, little bird," one of them had called after her as she fled into the darkness. "Run as fast as you can. We will find you. The boss always finds what belongs to him." She had been running ever since. Now, as the afternoon light thinned into a watery dusk, Mara saw something that made her heart stop. A thin ribbon of smoke rising ahead. Faint, almost torn away by the wind. But it was there. Hope in the shape of a gray line twisting upward against the purple sky. Where there was smoke, there was fire. And where there was fire, there was a roof. There was warmth. There was a chance. Mara forced her legs to move faster, stumbling toward the shape that slowly emerged from the gloom. A cabin, rough-hewn logs weathered to iron gray. A small corral with two horses braced against the wind. No other cabins nearby, no neighbors, no help if she chose wrong. But at least it was not the open plains. At least it was not certain death. She reached the door. There was no porch, just a single flat stone dragged into place as a step. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the rough wood. She knew what men thought when they saw a woman alone on foot. No horse, no baggage. Broken, desperate, easy to use. But the cold was in her bones now. It had seeped past her skin, past her muscles, down into the very center of her. She could feel her thoughts getting slower, her vision getting darker. If she did not go inside, she would die out here. It was that simple. Mara knocked on the door. The sound was barely a whisper in the storm. She waited, teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She knocked again, harder this time. Please, she whispered against the cold wood. Please let this be someone kind. Please let this be someone who will not hurt me. A latch clicked. The door opened slowly, pulled inward. A tall man filled the frame, blocking the orange glow of a fire behind him. He wore a heavy wool coat and a battered hat pulled low over his eyes. In his right hand was a Winchester rifle, held easy but ready. He did not speak. He just looked at her. His face was a map of hard miles, maybe mid-30s. Wind and sun had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. A scar cut from his temple down into his beard, a pale line against weathered skin. His eyes were dark and unreadable. Mara tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The warmth from inside hit her suddenly, like a wave of heat from an oven. The room tilted. Her knees buckled. "Help me," she rasped. "Please." The man did not move at first. He looked past her, scanning the horizon for others. A husband, a father, a posse. Seeing nothing but the barren plains, he looked back at her torn shoes, at her shaking hands, at her blue lips. Something flickered in his expression. Not pity exactly, maybe annoyance, maybe resignation. He stepped back an inch and lowered the rifle. "Come in before you let all the heat out," he said. His voice sounded like gravel under a wagon wheel, rough and low and tired. Mara stumbled inside. Her legs gave out and she pitched forward. He did not catch her, but he grabbed her arm to steady her against the doorframe. "Sit," he ordered, nodding toward a small table near the stove. Mara sat. The cabin was a single room, clean, sparse, warm. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, throwing off waves of blessed heat. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. Saddles hung from pegs. Everything functional. Everything simple. The man handed her a tin cup of cold water. She drank greedily, coughing as she swallowed. He ladled hot stew into a chipped bowl and set it before her. "Eat slow," he said. "Your stomach will not handle it if you rush." She tried to listen. She tried to go slow. But the hunger was too powerful. She ate until the bowl was empty, and then she sat there, shaking, waiting for whatever would come next. The man finally spoke again. "Where did you come from?" "Silver Creek," Mara answered. "That is 3 days walking, maybe 4. He stared at her, reading her like a trail sign. The bruises on her wrists, the way she flinched when he shifted his boots, the way she kept her eyes down. "You are running from something," he said. It was not a question. Mara did not answer. The man sighed heavily. "Name is Eli Turner," he said. "Mara," she whispered. Eli crossed his arms. "You can sleep here tonight, but tomorrow morning you head for the stage road. I will point you where to go." Her stomach dropped. The stage road was 2 days on foot. She would not survive it. She needed to stay. She needed warmth, food, shelter. And she had nothing to trade except the one thing men always wanted. Mara stood, legs trembling. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Turner," she whispered. He looked up. "I am not worth much, but I will do anything for a roof over my head." The words hung in the air between them. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. Eli Turner's jaw tightened. His hands balled into fists. For a moment, Mara thought he was going to throw her out into the storm. Instead, his voice came low and sharp. "No," he said, "not here." And the look in his eyes was not desire. It was not hunger. It was anger at the world that had made her believe that was all she was worth. The single word hung in the air like a thunderclap. No. Mara stared at Eli Turner, her mind struggling to understand. In her experience, men did not say no to that offer. They might negotiate the terms. They might take what they wanted without even bothering to ask, but they did not simply refuse. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli turned away from her and walked to the stove. He opened the iron door and threw another log onto the fire, watching the sparks rise before he closed it again. "I said no," he repeated. "Not here, not ever. Do you understand me?" Mara felt her cheeks burn with shame. She had offered herself like a piece of merchandise, and he had rejected her. She did not know whether to feel relieved or humiliated. "I did not mean to offend you," she said quickly. "I just thought maybe you would want something in return for letting me stay." Eli turned back to face her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his scarred face, making him look older than his years. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to sit down, finish warming up, and stop thinking that your body is some kind of payment you owe to every man who shows you basic human decency." Mara flinched at his words. They were not cruel, but they hit her like a slap. "I was not always like this," she said quietly. "I used to believe I was worth more. For Silver Creek. Before Wade Carter." Eli's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the name. "You know Wade Carter?" Mara laughed bitterly. "Know him? I belong to him. At least, that is what he told me. He said I was his property until I paid off my debt. Except the debt never got smaller. It only got bigger." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the narrow bed against the wall and pulled off the wool blanket. "You can take the bed tonight," he said. "I will sleep in the chair." Mara shook her head. "I can sleep on the floor. You have already done enough, not in this cold." "Take the bed." There was something in his voice that told her this was not up for discussion. Mara nodded slowly and walked to the bed. She touched the edge of the mattress. It was firm, clean, smelling faintly of cedar. Not the smell of cheap perfume and stale cigars she had grown used to in Silver Creek. She sat on the corner, unsure if she had the right to be there. Eli dropped into the wooden chair near the door. He rested one boot on the rung, leaning back like a man who had done this every night for years. His rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. "You do not have to stay awake," Mara said. "I am not going to steal anything." "I do," Eli replied. "Why?" "Because someone knocked on my door in the middle of a storm and told me she was willing to give up her dignity just for a roof over her head." His voice was calm, almost too calm. "So I am keeping watch, for both of us." Mara stared at the floorboards. Her cheeks burned with shame again. "I did not know what else to offer," she said quietly. Eli looked at her then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not judgment. It was something much worse. It was understanding. "You should not have to offer anything," he said. "Shelter is shelter. A person either gives it or they do not. There should not be conditions attached." Mara did not know how to respond to that. She had spent so long believing that everything had a price, that every kindness came with a hidden cost. The idea that someone would help her simply because she needed help felt foreign and strange. "Where I come from," she said slowly, "nothing is free." "Well," Eli replied, "you are not where you came from anymore." Mara lay back on the bed and pulled the thin blanket over herself. The warmth from the stove was seeping into her bones now, thawing the ice that had settled in her blood. She felt her eyes growing heavy. "Mr. Turner," she said. "Eli. Eli, why are you out here alone? This cabin is in the middle of nowhere." Eli was quiet for so long that Mara thought he was not going to answer. "I was married once," he finally said. "A long time ago. Her name was Sarah. We had a little piece of land down near Cheyenne. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." "What happened?" "There was a sickness that came through the territory. Cholera. It took her in 3 days." He paused. "After that, I could not stay there anymore. Too many memories. So I came up here. Built this cabin with my own hands. Started over." "I am sorry," Mara whispered. Eli shrugged. It was a long time ago, almost 10 years now. The pain does not go away, but you learn to carry it. Mara felt something shift in her chest. She had assumed he was just another hard man on the frontier, the kind who shot first and asked questions later. But underneath that rough exterior, there was a heart that had been broken. A heart that still remembered how to feel. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. "Sometimes, but lonely is better than pretending. I would rather be alone and honest than surrounded by people who only want something from me." Mara understood that more than she could say. "I have been surrounded by people for 6 months," she said. "Men who came and went every night. Women who pretended to be my friends but would sell me out for a nickel. And I have never felt more alone in my life." Eli nodded slowly. "That is the worst kind of lonely. When you are in a crowd but no one really sees you." He sees me, Mara thought suddenly. This stranger with the scarred face and the sad eyes, he actually sees me. Exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. Her last thought before sleep took her was that she should not have survived this long. Maybe she was only alive because she had reached this cabin and this man instead of another. She slept. It was the first peaceful sleep she had known in months. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The wind outside eased into a soft whisper. Eli sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the window. He did not know why he had let her stay. He had lived alone for almost 10 years, and in that time, he had learned to be careful. The frontier was full of desperate people who would kill you for a warm coat or a bag of flour. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. But there was something about this woman, something in the way she had offered herself so casually, as if she truly believed that was all she was worth. It had made him angry, not at her, but at the world that had taught her such a terrible lie. He thought about Sarah, about the way she used to laugh when he came in from the fields, covered in mud and smelling like horses. She had never looked at him like he was anything less than a king. What would she think if she could see him now, a lonely man in a lonely cabin, guarding a stranger he had just met? She would tell him he was doing the right thing. She always did. Eli closed his eyes for just a moment. That was when he heard the horses, not his horses. These were moving fast, coming from the direction of Silver Creek. He counted the hoofbeats in his head. 3 riders, maybe 4. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. Riders, 3 of them, dark shapes against the snow, moving with purpose. They knew exactly where they were going. Eli turned and crossed the room in the 2 strides. He shook Mara awake. "Get up," he said quietly. "We have company." Mara's eyes flew open. The fear in them was immediate and overwhelming. "They found me," she whispered. "Oh God, they found me." Eli grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the cabin. "Stay behind the bed," he ordered. "Keep your head down. Do not make a sound." "What are you going to do?" "Whatever I have to." The horses stopped outside. Heavy boots hit the frozen ground. Voices rose, rough and confident, the kind of men who thought the world belonged to them. A fist slammed against the door. "Turner!" a voice shouted. "Open up!" Mara froze. They knew his name. Eli did not react. He stood between her and the door like a wall, his rifle pointed at the entrance. "Go behind the bed," he said quietly. "Now." Mara scrambled behind the narrow cot, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The men outside laughed. "Come on, Eli," one of them called. "We know she came this way. The boss wants her back. She ain't worth dying over." Another voice, mean and lazy, added, "We will even leave you a cut for the trouble. Call it a finder's fee." Eli did not answer. The cabin stayed silent. The leader's patience snapped. "Last chance, Turner. Step aside or we are coming in." Eli raised his rifle and took aim at the door. "Try it," he said, and the night exploded into violence. The door shook as someone kicked it hard from the outside. Wood splintered at the frame, cracking like a gunshot. Eli did not flinch. He took one step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You boys take one more kick at that door," he warned, "and you ain't walking back to Silver Creek." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. The fire crackled in the stove. Then a cold, mocking chuckle drifted through the darkness. You always did think you were better than the rest of us, Turner. One of the riders spoke with contempt, dripping from every word. Fine, have it your way. Boots shuffled in the snow. Metal clicked as guns were drawn. Mara pressed herself flat against the floor behind the bed, her hands clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. A gunshot exploded through the night. The bullet tore through the top corner of the door, splintering wood and sending fragments flying across the cabin. Mara screamed despite herself, the sound torn from her throat before she could stop it. Eli did not move. He dropped to one knee, aimed his rifle at the crack in the frame, and fired a single clean shot. A man outside shouted in pain. His voice was high in surprise, the kind of sound a man makes when he suddenly realizes he is not invincible. He got Jeb, someone yelled. The son of a gun actually shot Jeb. Everything erupted at once. Shouting, the scrape of boots on frozen ground, the metallic shuffle of guns being drawn and cocked. Another bullet punched through the door, this one lower, tearing a hole the size of a man's fist. Eli fired again, and again. Through the chaos, Mara could see his face in the muzzle flash. He was not afraid. There was no panic in his eyes, no hesitation. He moved with the calm precision of a man who had done this before. A man who had seen too many battles and refused to lose this one. He glanced back at her once. "You are safe," he said, "no matter what happens tonight." Another gunshot tore through the window, shattering the glass. Cold air burst into the cabin like an invading army. Mara gasped as splinters scattered across the floor near her head. Eli moved without hesitation. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the cast-iron stove, pressing her down into the corner, where the thick metal would provide some protection. "Stay low," he ordered. "They will not leave," Mara whispered, her voice shaking. "Not until they have me. Wade does not give up. He never gives up." Eli looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "They are not getting you," he said, "not while I am breathing." The shouting outside grew louder. Boots crunched in the snow as the men spread out, circling the cabin, looking for weak points. "How many are there?" Mara asked. "3 that I can see, maybe more in the trees." "And you are going to fight them all?" Eli checked his rifle, counting the rounds. "I have dealt with worse." Mara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this stranger could protect her from the men who had been hunting her for days. But she had seen what Wade Carter was capable of. She had seen him break a man's arm for cheating at cards. She had seen him smile while he did it. "You do not understand," she said. "Wade is not like other men. He is not going to stop. If his men die out there, he will come himself. And then nothing will save us." Eli's jaw tightened. "Let him come," he said. "I am not handing a woman over to a man who thinks she is property." "Why?" Mara asked suddenly. "Why are you doing this? You do not even know me. You do not owe me anything." Eli was quiet for a moment. Outside, the gunfire had paused. The men were regrouping, planning their next move. "Because my wife died 10 years ago," he finally said. "And I spent a long time wondering why I survived when she did not. I figured there had to be a reason. Maybe this is it." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. Before she could respond, a new voice drifted through the darkness. It was different from the others. Smoother, colder, more confident. Eli Turner. Mara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She recognized that voice. She would recognize it anywhere. It haunted her dreams. It whispered in her nightmares. "Wade Carter. I think we need to have a conversation," Wade called out. Man to man, Eli moved to the broken window, staying out of the direct line of fire. He peered through a gap in the shattered frame. Mara knew what he was seeing, Wade on horseback, his pale gray eyes catching the moonlight, his black leather coat blending into the shadows. The men who followed him like loyal dogs, ready to kill or die on his command. "You have something that belongs to me," Wade continued. "Send her out, and this ends clean. Keep her, and I will burn that cabin to the ground with you in it." Mara grabbed Eli's sleeve. "You cannot fight him," she whispered desperately. "You do not know what he is capable of." Eli glanced at her. "I am not fighting for him," he said. "I am fighting for you." Before Mara could reply, Wade's voice grew sharper, more impatient. "Turner, you know me. You know how this goes. I always get what I want. The only question is how many people have to die first." Eli raised his voice so it would carry through the broken window. You are not getting her back, he called out. A cold laugh drifted through the darkness. You think you can protect her? Wade asked. You think you can protect yourself? You are one man in a wooden box. I have a dozen more coming from Silver Creek. By morning, this cabin will be ashes, and you will be feeding the coyotes. Eli did not waver. I can and I will, he said. Wade's tone shifted. The false friendliness disappeared, replaced by something harder, something dangerous. This is your last chance, he said. Send her out or I am coming in to get her myself. Eli stepped back from the window. He looked at Mara for a long moment. She was terrified. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her hands trembled, in the way she kept glancing at the door as if expecting Wade to burst through at any second. But there was something else in her eyes too, something that had not been there when she first stumbled through his door. Hope, a tiny spark of it, fragile and uncertain, but real. Someone was fighting for her. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to stand between her and the darkness. Eli reached into his belt and pulled out his revolver. He checked the cylinder, making sure all 6 chambers were loaded. Then he pressed the gun into Mara's shaking hands. If anyone gets past me, he said quietly, you shoot them. Mara stared at the weapon. It felt impossibly heavy in her palms. I have never shot anyone, she whispered. You will if you have to. Eli met her eyes. I trust you. Those 3 words hit her like a physical blow. I trust you. No one had ever said that to her. Not once, not in her entire miserable life. The men outside began to move. Boots crunched in the snow. Orders were shouted. Eli returned to his position at the window. His rifle was steady. His breathing was calm. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Let us end this. The first attacker came around the corner of the cabin, gun raised, eyes wild with adrenaline. He thought he was being clever. He thought Eli would not see him coming. Eli fired once. The man dropped into the snow and did not get up. 2 more came from the other direction. Eli swung his rifle, fired again. One of them screamed and fell. The other dove behind the corral fence, cursing. Wade shouted something from his position in the trees. More men emerged from the darkness, at least 4 more than Eli had counted before. Reinforcements. They had been waiting, planning. This was not a simple retrieval mission anymore. This was a siege. Eli felt his jaw tighten. He had enough ammunition to hold them off for a while, but not forever. Sooner or later, they would find a way in. He needed a new plan. Behind him, Mara clutched the revolver with white-knuckled hands and prayed for a miracle. The gunfire died down as quickly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. It stretched out across the frozen plains like a held breath, heavy and expectant. Mara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the cold sweat trickling down her back despite the warmth from the stove. Eli stood at the window, rifle ready, watching the darkness. What are they doing? Mara whispered. Waiting, Eli replied. They know they cannot rush the door without losing more men. So they are going to try to starve us out. How long can we hold? Eli did not answer right away. That told Mara everything she needed to know. We have water from the well out back, he finally said. Food for maybe 3 days if we are careful. Ammunition for about the same. And then we get creative. Mara crawled out from behind the stove and pressed her back against the wall. The revolver was still clutched in her hands, though her fingers had gone numb from gripping it so tightly. I am sorry, she said quietly. Eli glanced at her. For what? For bringing this to your door. You were living your life peacefully until I showed up. Now you are trapped in here with killers outside. Eli shrugged. I was living my life quietly. There is a difference. Quiet is not the same as peaceful. What do you mean? I mean, I have been hiding out here for 10 years, pretending the world did not exist. Telling myself I was done with violence, done with fighting, done with caring about anything. He looked out the window again. Maybe this is exactly what I needed, a reason to remember what I used to fight for. Mara was quiet for a moment. What did you used to fight for? She asked. People who could not fight for themselves. She thought about that. In Silver Creek, she had known plenty of men who claimed to be fighters. Men who swaggered through the saloons with guns on their hips, looking for trouble. But they only fought for themselves. For money, for pride, for the thrill of watching someone else bleed. Eli Turner was different. She could see it in the way he stood, in the way he spoke, in the way he had refused her offer without a moment's hesitation. He was a man with a code, and that code did not include treating women like property. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly. Eli stiffened slightly. "That is not really a story for tonight." "I know, but I want to understand you. Why you are doing this." For a long moment, Eli said nothing. Then he sighed and leaned against the wall, keeping one eye on the window. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "We met at a church social back in Kansas. I was 22 years old and the dumbest cowpoke you ever saw. She was the smartest woman in the room. I have no idea why she gave me the time of day." "Love is funny like that," Mara said quietly. "Yeah, it is." Eli's voice softened. "We got married 3 months later. Her father thought I was not good enough for her, and he was probably right. But she believed in me. She believed I could be something more than just another drifter with a fast gun and a slow brain." "What happened?" "We moved out to Wyoming, got a little piece of land near Cheyenne. I worked cattle during the day and built our house at night. By the time it was finished, my hands were covered in calluses and splinters, but I did not care. It was ours." He paused. "The cholera came into the summer of '68. They called it the summer sickness. It moved through the territory like wildfire. Sarah got sick on a Monday. She was dead by Thursday." Mara felt her heart clench. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Eli shook his head. "It was a long time ago, but I never forgot what she told me before she died. She said that the world was full of people who needed help, and that the measure of a man was not how many fights he won, but how many people he stood up for." "Is that why you are helping me?" "Maybe, or maybe I am just too stubborn to let a bunch of Silver Creek thugs tell me what to do in my own home." Despite everything, Mara almost smiled. A shout from outside interrupted them. "Turner!" Wade's voice carried across the snow. "I am giving you one more chance. Send the girl out, and you walk away clean. No hard feelings." Eli did not even look toward the window. "No deal," he called back. "You are making a mistake," Wade warned. "By morning, I will have 20 men out here. You cannot fight all of them." "Then I will die trying," Eli replied. "And I will take as many of you with me as I can." Silence again. Then after a long moment, Mara heard the sound of horses moving away. "They are falling back," Eli said. "They will make camp somewhere nearby and wait for reinforcements. So we have until morning, probably." Eli turned to look at her, "Which means we have until morning to figure out how to get you out of here alive." Mara shook her head. "I am not leaving without you." Eli raised an eyebrow. "We just met." "I know, but you are the first person in years who has treated me like a human being instead of merchandise." She met his eyes. "I am not going to repay that by running away while you die for me." Something shifted in Eli's expression. A flicker of surprise, maybe, or respect. "You are different than I expected," he said quietly. "So are you." They stood there in the dim firelight, two strangers bound together by circumstances beyond their control. Outside, the wind howled across the plains. Inside, the fire crackled and the shadows danced. "Get some rest," Eli finally said. "I will keep watch. In a few hours, I will wake you and we will figure out our next move together." Mara nodded. She moved back to the bed and lay down, but this time she did not let go of the revolver. It stayed in her hands, heavy and cold, a reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the walls. She closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. How could she? Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of wind through the broken window sent her heart racing. But somehow, despite everything, she felt safer than she had in months. Because for the first time, she was not facing the darkness alone. Eli watched her from his position near the window. In the firelight, with her auburn hair spread across the pillow and her face relaxed in exhaustion, she almost looked peaceful. He wondered what her life had been like before Silver Creek, before Wade Carter in the gambling hall and the endless parade of men who used her and discarded her. She must have been young once, innocent, full of hope. The world had taken all of that away from her, but tonight, right here in this cabin, she had shown him something he had not seen in a long time. Courage. She could have begged him to hand her over. She could have tried to slip out the back door and take her chances in the snow. Instead, she had picked up his revolver and told him she was not leaving without him. That was not the action of a broken woman. That was the action of a survivor. Eli felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt since Sarah died. Hope. Maybe he was not as dead inside as he had thought. Maybe there was still something worth fighting for. He looked out the window at the dark shapes moving in the trees. Wade Carter and his men were settling in for the night, building fires, passing around bottles of whiskey. They thought they had all the time in the world. They were wrong. By morning, Eli would be ready for them, and this time he would not be fighting alone. The first gray light of dawn crept across the Wyoming plains like a thief. Mara woke to the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The cabin, the gunfire, the men waiting outside. It all seemed like a nightmare. Then she saw Eli standing at the window, rifle in hand, and reality came crashing back. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee is ready." Mara sat up slowly. Her body ached from sleeping in her clothes, and the revolver had left a bruise on her hip where it had pressed against her all night. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "An hour or two, enough to keep going." She rose from the bed and poured herself a cup of coffee. It was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. "What is the plan?" she asked. Eli finally turned to look at her. His face was drawn, tired, but his eyes were sharp. "I counted 12 men out there last night," he said. "More probably came during the night. We are outnumbered and outgunned. So what do? We even the odds." Eli walked to the back of the cabin and knelt beside a loose floorboard. He pried it up and reached into the darkness beneath. When he stood up, he was holding a double-barreled shotgun, a box of shells, and 2 sticks of dynamite. Mara's eyes went wide. "Where did you get those?" "I was not always a peaceful hermit," Eli said with a faint smile. "There was a time when I worked as a deputy marshal down in Kansas. You learn to keep a few surprises handy." "You were a lawman?" "For about 5 years, until I got tired of watching guilty men walk free because they had money and connections." He loaded the shotgun with practiced ease. "But that is a story for another time. Right now, we need to focus on survival." Mara nodded. She picked up the revolver and checked the cylinder the way she had seen Eli do it the night before. "Tell me what to do," she said. Eli looked at her for a long moment. "You have changed," he said quietly. "From the woman who stumbled through my door last night." "I had to." She met his eyes. "You gave me something to fight for." "What is that?" "A future." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Before either of them could speak again, a shout came from outside. "Turner, time is up. Send the girl out or we are coming in." Eli moved to the front window. Through the broken glass, he could see Wade Carter sitting on his horse at the edge of the trees. His men were spread out in a wide arc around the cabin, guns drawn. "It ends now," Eli said quietly. He turned to Mara. "I need you to do exactly what I say. When I give the signal, you open that back door and run for the tree line. There is a trail about 50 yards past the big pine. Follow it north until you hit the stage road." "I told you," Mara said firmly. "I am not leaving without you. You might not have a choice." "Eli, listen to me." She grabbed his arm. "I have spent my whole life being rescued by men who expected something in return. I have spent my whole life being traded and sold and used." She paused. "You are the first person who ever treated me like I was worth something. If I run away and leave you to die, then everything you have done means nothing." Eli stared at her. "You could get killed," he said. "I could have died in that snowstorm. I could have died in Silver Creek. I could have died 100 times in the last 6 months." She raised her chin. "If I'm going to die, I would rather die fighting alongside someone who believes in me than running away alone." For a moment, Eli said nothing. Then slowly a smile spread across his weathered face. "You really are something else, Mara. Is that a yes?" "That is a yes." He handed her the shotgun. "You take the back door. Anybody comes through there, you give them both barrels. Do not hesitate. Do not warn them. Just shoot." Mara nodded. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a conversation with Wade Carter." Eli picked up his rifle and walked to the front door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "Mara." "Yes?" "Whatever happens out there, I want you to know something." He looked over his shoulder. "Meeting you was the best thing that has happened to me in 10 years. Before she could respond, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving the world covered in a pristine blanket of white. Under other circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But all Eli could see were the guns pointed at him. Wade Carter smiled from his horse. Finally, he said, "I was starting to think you were going to make me burn the place down." "That is still an option," Eli replied. "But I figured you would want to talk first. Men like you always do." Wade's smile faded slightly. "Men like me? Men who think they are smarter than everyone else. Men who use money and power to control people. Men who are too cowardly to fight their own battles." The other gunmen shifted uncomfortably. Nobody talked to Wade Carter like that, but Wade just laughed. "You have got guts, Turner. I will give you that." He leaned forward in his saddle. "But guts will not stop a bullet. And right now you are surrounded by about 15 of them." "I can count," Eli said. "But here is the thing about numbers. They do not mean much when you are fighting for something you believe in. And what exactly are you fighting for?" Eli looked Wade directly in the eye. "I am fighting for the idea that a human being is not property, that a woman is not something you can buy and sell like livestock, that there are still some things in this world worth dying for." Wade's expression hardened. "Very heroic," he said coldly. "Very stupid, but heroic." He raised his hand, signaling his men to take aim. "Last chance, Turner." "Where's the girl?" Eli smiled. "Right behind you." Wade started to turn, confusion flickering across his face. That was when the back door of the cabin exploded open and Mara came out with the shotgun blazing. The shotgun roared like thunder. The two men closest to the back of the cabin went down before they even knew what was happening. The blast caught them in the side, spinning them around like rag dolls. Mara did not stop to think. She pumped the shotgun and fired again, this time at a third man who was turning toward her with his gun raised. He dropped into the snow with a cry of pain. Behind her, she could hear Eli's rifle cracking, steady and controlled. "Move," he shouted. "Get to the corral." Mara ran. The snow was deep and her legs burned with every step, but she forced herself forward. Bullets whizzed past her head, kicking up puffs of white powder. She did not look back. She could not afford to. The corral was only about 20 yards away, but it felt like a mile. Her lungs were on fire. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. She threw herself behind the wooden fence just as a bullet splintered the post above her head. For a moment, she just lay there, gasping for breath. Then she forced herself to look through the gaps in the fence. The scene outside was chaos. Wade's men were scattered, some firing at the cabin, others trying to find cover. Two of them were down and not moving. A third was crawling toward the trees, leaving a red trail in the snow behind him. And in the middle of it all stood Eli Turner. He moved like a man possessed. His rifle was empty, so he had switched to his revolver. Every shot found its mark. A man went down with each crack of the gun, but there were too many of them. Mara saw a cluster of gunmen working their way around the side of the cabin, trying to flank Eli. He did not see them. He was too focused on the men in front of him. She had to do something. She looked at the shotgun in her hands. One shell left. Mara stood up. "Hey!" she shouted. The flanking gunman turned toward her, surprised. She fired. The blast caught the closest man in the chest. He went down hard. The others scattered, diving for cover. That gave Eli the opening he needed. He spun around and dropped two more of them with quick, precise shots. For a moment, there was silence. Then Wade Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Mara turned to see Wade dismounting from his horse. His face was twisted with rage, his pale gray eyes burning with cold fury. "You have caused me a lot of trouble, Turner," he said. "And you," he pointed at Mara. "You have cost me a fortune in men and time." "You should have let me go," Mara replied. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Let you go?" Wade laughed bitterly. "You belong to me. You still belong to me. Every dollar you cost me tonight just gets added to your debt. I do not owe you anything." Wade's eyes narrowed. "Maybe not. But your new friend here is going to pay for what he has done." He reached for his gun. Eli was faster. The shot echoed across the plains. Wade staggered backward, his hand clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers. "I missed on purpose," Eli said coldly. "Next one goes between your eyes." Wade stared at him, shock and disbelief warring on his face. You shot me, he whispered. I shot you, Eli confirmed, and I will kill you if you do not call off your men right now. For a long moment, nobody moved. The surviving gunmen looked at their boss, waiting for orders. Wade looked at Eli. Eli looked at Wade. The standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Wade spoke. Stand down, he said through gritted teeth. All of you, stand down. Slowly, reluctantly, the gunmen lowered their weapons. Mara felt her knees go weak with relief. Now, Eli said, you are going to get on your horse, take your men, and ride back to Silver Creek. And you are never going to bother this woman again. Or what? Wade spat. Or I will finish what I started. Eli walked toward him slowly, his revolver never wavering. I have killed plenty of men in my time, Carter. Most of them deserved it. You are no different. Wade's face went pale. For all his bravado, for all his money and power, Wade Carter was a coward at heart. He was used to having others do his dirty work. He was not prepared to face a man like Eli Turner alone. Fine, Wade said finally. You win, for now. He struggled onto his horse, clutching his wounded shoulder. But this is not over, Turner. I promise you that. Eli shrugged. I will be here when you are ready for round 2. Wade turned his horse and rode away into the dawn. His surviving men followed, some of them limping, others being helped along by their companions. Mara watched them go until they disappeared over the horizon. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to collapse. Eli was beside her in an instant. Are you hurt? He asked, his hands running over her arms and shoulders, checking for wounds. No, she managed, just tired. So tired. He helped her to her feet and led her back toward the cabin. It is over, he said quietly. Is it? What if he comes back? Then we will deal with him again. Eli met her eyes. But for now, you are safe. That is all that matters. Mara looked at the man who had risked his life for her, the stranger who had become something more. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Eli just smiled. Come on, he said. Let us get you inside. I think we have earned some breakfast. 3 days passed. The snow melted slowly under the pale winter sun, revealing the muddy earth beneath. The bodies of Wade Carter's men had been hauled away by a group of farmers from the nearest settlement who came to investigate the gunfire. They listened to Eli's story with wide eyes and nodded their approval. About time someone stood up to that snake, one of them had said. He has been terrorizing Silver Creek for years. The news spread quickly. By the end of the second day, a deputy marshal from Cheyenne arrived at the cabin. He was a young man with earnest eyes and a well-worn badge, and he listened carefully as Eli and Mara recounted everything that had happened. Wade Carter is wanted on a dozen charges, the marshal said when they finished. Fraud, extortion, kidnapping. The territorial governor has been looking for an excuse to shut down his operation for years. This might be exactly what we need. What about Mara? Eli asked. She is not in any trouble? The marshal shook his head. Self-defense, he said, clear as day. And from what you have told me, she was being held against her will in Silver Creek. That makes her a victim, not a criminal. Mara felt tears prick at her eyes. For so long, she had believed that no one would ever see her as anything but what she had been forced to become. But here was a lawman looking at her with respect and sympathy. Thank you, she whispered. The marshal nodded. There will be some paperwork, he said. Maybe a hearing down in Cheyenne. But I do not think you have anything to worry about. He paused. I will let you know when we need your testimony. In the meantime, stay safe. After the marshal left, Eli and Mara sat together at the small table in the cabin. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the last of the snow was dripping from the roof. What are you going to do now? Eli asked. Mara shook her head slowly. I do not know. I have no money, no family, nowhere to go. You could stay here. The words hung in the air between them. Mara looked at him. Stay here? With you? If you want. Eli shifted uncomfortably. I am not asking for anything in return. I just mean that the cabin is big enough for 2 people, and I could use the help with the horses. Mara felt her heart skip a beat. Is that really what you want? She asked carefully. You have lived alone for 10 years, and I have been lonely for every single one of them. Eli met her eyes. You asked me once why I was doing this, why I was risking my life for a stranger. The truth is, I did not know myself at first, but now I do. Why? Because you reminded me what it feels like to care about something, to fight for something, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Mara felt the tears spilling down her cheeks now. She did not try to stop them. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not have to say anything. Eli reached across the table and took her hand. Just stay, give yourself a chance to heal. And if you decide you want to leave someday, I will help you get wherever you want to go. No strings attached. Mara looked at their joined hands. His fingers were rough and calloused, scarred from years of hard work. But they were gentle too. Safe. I will stay, she said. For now. Eli nodded. For now is enough. The days turned into weeks. Mara settled into a rhythm at the cabin. She learned to cook on the cast iron stove, to mend clothes, to tend to the horses. Eli taught her how to ride and how to shoot properly. By the end of the first month, she could hit a tin can from 50 yards. She also began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently now. The memories of Silver Creek, of Wade Carter, of the endless parade of men who had used her. All of it began to fade like an old photograph left in the sun. She started to remember who she had been before all of that, before the boarding house and the gambling hall, before the debt that was never meant to be repaid. She remembered a girl who had once dreamed of falling in love and having a family, a girl who had believed that good things could happen to ordinary people. Maybe they still could. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Mara walked out to the corral where Eli was brushing the horses. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." She hesitated. "Do you ever think about getting married again?" Eli's hand paused on the horse's mane. "I used to think I never would," he said slowly. "After Sarah died, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that I had used up all the love I had to give. And now," he looked at her, "now I am not so sure." Mara felt her breath catch. What changed? Eli set down the brush and walked toward her. "You changed everything," he said simply. "You showed me that I was not as dead inside as I thought, that I still had something left to give." "Eli," Mara whispered. "I am not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know you have been through more than most people could handle. I know you need time. But I want you to know that if you ever wanted more than this, if you ever wanted me, I would be honored." Mara looked at him, at his kind eyes, at his weathered face, at the man who had risked everything for her without expecting anything in return. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, like two people learning a new language together. But then his arms wrapped around her, and her hands found his shoulders, and suddenly it was the most natural thing in the world. When they finally pulled apart, Eli was smiling. "Does that answer your question?" Mara asked. "It does," he said. "But I would not mind hearing it again, just to be sure." She laughed and kissed him again. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara felt truly happy. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted, the creeks filled with cold, clear water, and the grass began to push up through the thawing earth. Wildflowers bloomed on the hillsides, carpeting the plains in yellow and purple. Mara watched the transformation from the porch of the cabin. 3 months had passed since the night Wade Carter's men had come. 3 months since her life had changed forever. She barely recognized the woman she had been back then. Broken, desperate, convinced that she had nothing to offer the world except her body. Now she was learning to ride and shoot. She was helping Eli work the small herd of cattle he was building. She was cooking and cleaning and mending, not because a man demanded it, but because she wanted to contribute. And every night she fell asleep in Eli Turner's arms, feeling safe and loved. It was more than she had ever dared to dream, but she knew it could not last. Not yet. Not while Wade Carter was still free. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dusty rider from Cheyenne. Eli read it first, his brow furrowing. "It is from the marshal," he said. "Wade Carter is going to trial next week. They want both of us to testify." Mara felt her stomach clench. "I have to face him again?" "You do not have to do anything." Eli put down the letter. "If you do not want to go, I can testify alone." Mara shook her head. "No, I need to do this, for myself, for all the other women he has hurt." Eli looked at her with pride in his eyes. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said. No, I am just tired of being afraid. They left for Cheyenne the following day. The trial took place in a grand courthouse with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. Mara had never been inside such a building before. It felt intimidating, but Eli's hand on her arm gave her strength. Wade Carter sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits. His shoulder was still bandaged where Eli had shot him. When he saw Mara enter the room, his eyes narrowed with hatred. She did not look away. Let him hate me, she thought. I am not afraid of him anymore. The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed woman named Elizabeth Harper, one of the few female lawyers in the territory. She questioned Mara with patience and respect, guiding her through the story of her time in Silver Creek. Mara told them everything. She told them about the debt that could never be repaid, about the threats and the violence, about the men who came to her room night after night while Wade counted the money. She told them about the night she ran and the men who chased her across the frozen plains. She told them about Eli Turner, the stranger who took her in and refused to hand her over. By the time she finished, half the courtroom was in tears. The defense attorney tried to discredit her. He called her a fallen woman. He suggested she had chosen her profession willingly. He implied that she was making up stories to get revenge on a respectable businessman. But Mara did not falter. I did not choose this life, she said, her voice steady. Wade Carter forced it on me. He trapped me with debts I never owed. He threatened to hurt me if I tried to leave. And when I ran, he sent armed men to drag me back. She pointed at Wade. That man is not a businessman. He is a monster. And I am not the only woman he has destroyed. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Wade's lawyers fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. A dozen other women came forward with similar stories. Records from the gambling hall showed how Wade had manipulated the books to keep his victims in perpetual debt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. Wade Carter was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. As the bailiffs led him away, he looked at Mara with pure hatred in his eyes. This is not over, he hissed. Yes, it is, she replied calmly. It is over, and you lost. He had nothing to say to that. Outside the courthouse, Mara stood in the spring sunshine and breathed deeply. The air smelled of grass and flowers and freedom. How do you feel? Eli asked. She smiled. Like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders, like I can finally start living again. Eli put his arm around her. So what do you want to do now? He asked. Mara looked at him, at this man who had saved her life and given her hope, at this man who loved her without expecting anything in return. I want to go home, she said. Home, she nodded, that cabin on the plains, with you and the horses and the mountains in the distance. That is home now. Eli smiled. Then let us go home. They rode out of Cheyenne together, side by side. Behind them, the courthouse stood tall against the blue sky, a monument to justice finally served. Ahead of them, the Wyoming plains stretched out forever, golden and green and full of promise. Mara had walked through those plains once, alone and dying. Now she was riding through them with the man she loved, toward a future she had never dared to imagine. She had never felt more alive. Summer came to Wyoming in a blaze of color. The plains were alive with wildflowers and singing birds. The creeks ran full and cold. The sun hung long in the sky, stretching the days into endless golden hours. Mara and Eli worked the land together. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a proper porch. They built a new corral for the horses and started a small vegetable garden behind the house. The neighbors from the settlement came to help, bringing food and tools and friendship. Word had spread about what Eli had done, and people wanted to meet the man who had stood up to Wade Carter. More importantly, they wanted to meet the woman who had inspired him to fight. Mara found herself surrounded by kindness for the first time in her life. Women brought her bread and invited her to quilting circles. Men tipped their hats to her in town. Children ran up to pet the horses and ask her to tell stories about the big battle. It was strange being treated like a person instead of property. Strange, but wonderful. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, Eli took Mara's hand and led her to the top of a small hill overlooking their land. Look at this, he said, all of it. The cabin, the horses, the garden. None of it would exist without you. Mara shook her head. You built the cabin. You bought the horses. I did not do anything. You gave me a reason to care again. That is everything." They stood together in the fading light, watching the shadows lengthen across the plains. Eli cleared his throat. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about us, about the future." Mara turned to look at him. "What about it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It gleamed in the sunset, catching the light. "A ring. This was my grandmother's," Eli said. "She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to Sarah. Sarah wore it every day until she died." He held it out to her. "I know we have not known each other long," he continued, "and I know you have been through things that no one should ever have to experience. But I also know that I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." Mara felt tears streaming down her face. "Eli," she whispered. "Mara, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, at his hopeful, nervous face, at the land spread out before them, full of possibility. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Eli slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and the world fell away until there was nothing left but the two of them, standing on that hilltop, holding each other as the stars came out one by one. "I love you," Mara whispered against his chest. "I love you too," Eli replied. "More than I ever thought possible." They stayed there until the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the plains. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter full of love and hope and happiness. And Mara knew deep in her heart that this was just the start. They were married in the autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and the air was crisp and clear. The ceremony was small and simple, held in a little church in the nearest settlement. The neighbors came, of course, and the deputy marshal from Cheyenne, who had believed Mara's story when no one else would. Mara wore a white dress that the women from the quilting circle had made for her. It was not fancy, but it was beautiful. She felt beautiful wearing it. Eli wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, and he looked at Mara like she was the only woman in the world. The preacher read the vows. Eli and Mara repeated them, their voices steady and strong. "I do," Eli said. "I do," Mara said, and then they were married. That night they celebrated with their friends and neighbors. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. People laughed and told stories and raised toasts to the happy couple. Mara looked around at all these people who had welcomed her into their community. People who had never asked about her past or judged her for the things she had been forced to do. She had found something she never thought she would have. A home, a family, a future. "Thank you," she whispered to Eli as they danced together under the stars. "For what?" "For saving my life. For believing in me. For giving me all of this." Eli smiled. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just gave you a place to land." She kissed him then, soft and sweet. "You gave me so much more than that," she said. "You gave me hope." The years passed quickly after that. They built a bigger cabin. They raised horses and cattle. They had children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up strong and free on the Wyoming plains. Mara never forgot the woman she had been. The desperate, broken girl who had walked through a snowstorm believing she had nothing left to offer. But she also never let that woman define her. She was Mara Turner now. Wife, mother, survivor. And she was happy. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the plains and the snow piled up against the windows, she would sit by the fire with her family and tell stories. She told them about the night she knocked on a stranger's door and found something she never expected. Love, redemption, a second chance. And she always ended the same way. "Remember this," she would say to her children. "No matter how dark things get, no matter how lost you feel, never give up. Because somewhere out there, there is someone who will see your worth, someone who will fight for you, someone who will love you exactly as you are." The children would nod solemnly, not fully understanding, but sensing the importance of her words. And Eli would take her hand and squeeze it gently, his eyes shining with love and pride. They lived the rest of their lives together on that little piece of land in Wyoming. They grew old side by side, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and all the blessings they had never expected to receive. And when people asked Mara what the secret to happiness was, she always gave the same answer. "Find someone worth fighting for," she would say, "and never let them go."